The Olympic fanfare has swept across Paris in recent weeks, but there's an elephant in the room that's difficult to ignore. The glaring disparity between France hosting one of the most multicultural events in the world and at the same time cracking down on diversity. As the Games come to a close, France says it has hosted the first gender-equal Games in the history of the event. Yet, some of its own Muslim athletes were forced to remove their hijab in order to compete, under a ban which stands in stark contradiction with this pledge to champion equality. The controversy brought back into the spotlight the rising anti-ethnic and Islamophobic rhetoric in France. The country has been the subject of criticism over its hardline policies for some time. Just last year, it introduced a contested immigration bill, parts of which were deemed unconstitutional. France's top administrative court upheld a government ban on girls in state schools wearing abayas, rejecting complaints that it was discriminatory. Researchers say that these policies have bred a mainstream culture of xenophobia and racism and fueled an unprecedented rise of far-right politics. So much so that more ethnic minorities of North African origins and French Muslims are opting to immigrate to other countries. I'm Fath ibn Isa, and this is Beyond the Headlines. This week, against the backdrop of the Olympics, we look at the roots of this contrast, and we ask, what is the impact of France's racial divisions on its Arab, North African, and Muslim communities? Just weeks before the Games began, a tense parliamentary election sent ripples across France as the far-right National Rally Party gained massive momentum, sparking concern not just from its centrist and leftist opponents, but from France's multi-ethnic Arab, African and Muslim communities. But Suniva Rose, the National's correspondent in Paris, says the spotlight has since been shifting.
The contrast between France today and France last month couldn't be any stronger. There was a lot of anxiety, especially among immigrant communities, that maybe they're going to be considered second-class citizens if the far right came to power. There was even talk of some people maybe leaving France, and all of this because the far right had campaigned on ideas such as, for example, that dual nationals, especially it was heavily implied if they come from North Africa, shouldn't be allowed to hold key positions, for example, be a minister. And they were also saying that people born of foreign parents wouldn't be allowed to become French anymore, even if they were born in France. So there was really a lot of worry. And then now suddenly, honestly, there's this great moment of cohesion, of happiness and joy in the streets of Paris. It's like it's forgotten. And even when you talk to the Arab community, they're really into the Olympics, but they also know that it's there, it's going on in the background, politics are going on in the background, and we have to expect a kind of return to reality within a few weeks. But it's really a great question mark how it's going to move forward.
In January 2022, the French Senate voted to ban hijab in sports competitions. In September of last year, it was confirmed the ban would also apply to the French athletes participating in the Paris Olympics.
This French sprinter, Soukamba Silla, who is originally from Guinea in West Africa, she publicly complained about it because she wasn't allowed to wear her veil during the opening ceremony. After some negotiation, she got to wear a hat and she found a way to cover her hair. And I think really what's at the heart here of the discussion is the interpretation of what the veil means. For France, it's a religious outfit, whereas for a lot of Olympic federations, it's a cultural outfit. So, and for in the eyes of the French government, these athletes are in a kind of public service moment when they're representing France. And because they're representing their country, they're not supposed to show any religious or political external signs in their clothes or anything. So that's how they stick to the interpretation of laïcité. Last year in June, France's highest administrative court upheld a football federation ban on headscarves, but that was a legal action that had been brought from French football players, female football players who wear the veil. They call themselves the hijabeuses, which is a contraction of hijab and footballeuses. And in that decision, the court actually didn't follow the public rapporteur's recommendation that said that the ban should be annulled. So there's a discussion going on, and there is a pushback against this ban on the veil and what is viewed as discriminatory practice on female athletes, female Muslim athletes.
While there has been pushback on the ban from within France, Suniva says the backlash seems to stem mostly from abroad.
Maybe this one incident has been contained so far, but often what we see is that these kinds of incidents in France cause more interest outside France than within France, where really there's quite, I think, a broad, I think in the general public, I haven't seen it discussed much, and I think people actually quite support this idea of laïcité in the general public.
I think that this abstract principle prevents France from seeing itself as it is.
This is Hisham Ben Isa, a French sociologist whose work focuses on migration, racism, and religion in France.
Today, France presents itself to the world during the Olympics with the image of diversity, while a few days ago we had an election where the far right was close to victory. In France, there has always been a form of immense gap between the high principle that this country claims to defend and the concrete reality of its policy. It should be added that this Olympic ceremony took place in Paris, which is a city often accused of being disconnected from the rest of France. During the last election, Paris resisted the rise of the far right, but Paris is not France.
Hicham explained that the xenophobic sentiments that represent that reality of France are rooted in the country's history.
After the Second World War, France needed a large workforce to rebuild itself, mainly from the Maghreb countries. A cheap labor force ready to take on the most thankless jobs in the French industrial system. All the jobs the nationals didn't want. In a way, this was a continuation of the colonial situation, since these immigrants from the Maghreb were all ex-colonized. Things changed following the oil crisis that had a major impact on the French economy. The immigrant workers who had been so important to French industry were no longer so in the new economic configuration. In this configuration, the French state has put in place a whole series of measures encouraging immigrants to return to their country of origin. In the meantime, the immigrant workers brought their wives and had children who were born in France, and therefore who are in fact French. From the beginning of the 1980s, their situation was legally stabilized, but their presence still remains contested on a symbolic level. It seems to me that we have not left this historical sequence.
Decades later, a new iteration of this ideology has become more mainstream, and it's taken a noticeable toll on Muslim and North African minorities in particular.
This feeling of worry is narration by a long history which does not date from this election. But we can say that this election constitutes the culmination of this long historical process. This election made the strength of the far right in France politically visible. If it has become so strong, it is partly thanks to the racism and Islamophobia on which it has thrived for 40 years. France is today contaminated by this racism, and it's hard to say how well we recover from this. If the far right did not come to power this time, nothing says that it will not succeed next time. And Arabs and Muslims know that they will be the first to suffer the consequences. And everything indicates that things are not going to improve. In this case, leaving becomes a viable option.
I grew up in France and did most of my professional career before the UK. It was in Paris. My name is Fatia Zegir. I've been living in the UK for 11 years now, and I work as an executive assistant in a fintech company. I grew up in a Muslim family. My parents were born in Algeria, which is a former French colony. My father came in the 60s. My mother followed in the 70s. Where I grew up, it wasn't a poor area. It was, I would say, a mid-level, middle-class kind of area. My father was a construction site worker, and my mother was a childminder. So we were kind of lower class in that sense. I grew up in an area where there was a lot of immigration, but not just Arabic. It was okay. It was actually, I never really had at the time, neither my parents really, any issue with racism. It's later when I started understanding things, the first time I was really confronted to racism, Islamophobia, was through political rhetoric. Every time around the elections, it's always the same thing in France. We are like the Islamic community or North African community, not necessarily Islamic, are the usual suspects when it comes to anything, but not just North Africans, also Africans. Year after year, election after election, it was always the same thing. Obviously, it changed a lot after the 9/11 attacks. I could see the difference, definitely. 9/11, because there was such misunderstanding about what Islam is, people started getting attacked.
Fatiha didn't move to the UK because of the racism at home. She went to build a life there. But like many other ethnic minorities in France, she has felt the weight of widespread discrimination in her own country.
Discrimination I faced was not because I was a Muslim, but because I belonged to the Muslim culture. It's so riddled with loads of prejudice because they don't know. So the fantasies take over their knowledge of what a Muslim family looks like. So there was this kind of colonialist, paternalistic behavior where they would want to save girls from these families by giving them jobs, because then we're helping you get a career so you have your money, so you don't have to get married at 20. I can't say that there was bad intention or malice, but clearly a massive level of ignorance, but also a laziness, not wanting to know us. So they would say like, oh, Fatia, I hope you don't get married to an Arabic man because they're violent. Or things like, so I have curls, I am a curly person, and I was told things like, if you want to make it, you have to basically erase how Arabic you are or how exotic you are. So it's nicer if you straighten your hair. Curly hair is messy. You have to be elegant, like Paris style elegant. I would be encouraged to drink, because obviously it's easier to be accepted in the workplace. It's nicer to have social moments where I also drink, because if I don't drink because I'm a Muslim, then I'm setting myself apart, then I'm not integrating. And so they were putting importance in tiny things that they thought were incredibly French. And if I adopted them, then it made it easier for me to integrate.
Even though she may not have noticed it at the time, this had a huge impact on the way she lived her life and formed her identity.
I believed in their stance. I really thought that to integrate, I had to adopt these kind of Western codes of social acceptability. Like I wasn't strong enough at first, because it was a lot for me to understand all the intricacies. Now, with time, I realized that I caved a lot. The more I was displaying these behaviors, the more accepted I was, the more, and so I thought for me that was what progress was like. But I didn't realize that I was actually playing their game. I was not being myself. I thought that's okay. It's France. It's how it's supposed to be. I didn't realize that I was sacrificing a part of my identity until I understood it, until I really thought about it. When I came to the UK and I saw that my identity, my intersectionality was actually a gift. In France, it wasn't seen as a gift. It was like a flaw. It was an obstacle. In France, you had to be uniform. You had to be like a Mr. Smith in the Matrix. You couldn't show or display any kind of difference. Here, what I really appreciated in this country is I was taken for whoever I was. Not a problem being French, not a problem being Islamic. Here, I freed myself from all those expectations.
In recent years, a growing number of highly qualified French citizens, both practicing Muslims and those from a Muslim background, have left France in a phenomenon researchers describe as a silent exodus. To get a better sense of the circumstances that are driving them to leave, I speak to Olivier Esteves, who co-authored a book on this very topic, called France, You Love It, But You Leave It. I ask him what his research showed about the people who feel pressured to leave France.
First of all, the fact that this is not a new phenomenon, but it's a phenomenon that has been increasing since around 2015, 2016. The second thing is the vast majority of the people that we're talking about are people that are highly qualified. In other words, people that have the economic capital, the social capital, and the cultural capital to actually leave France. So because of this selection bias, we also felt that A substantial majority of the people that we talked to are people that tend to be profoundly religious. And it is very debatable what is meant by profoundly religious. How do you adhere to a faith when you are a Muslim? And this is almost an endless debate. But people that really tend to strongly identify with the Muslim religion. I think this is by and large the major findings in our book.
Some of the main factors behind this phenomenon are religious practice, or were there other factors as well that you found through these surveys?
There's a substantial minority of people that kick off the interview by saying, I'm not really a Muslim, or I don't really identify as Muslim, but my name is Muhammad. I have the wrong name, I have the wrong face, and on my CV, it actually shows. Therefore, people that felt that they were forced out of France because of a racial, ethnic, and religious discrimination. So it's not only about Islamophobia. Islamophobia is the big picture. It's at the heart of this research of ours, but it's not only about that. It's also about discrimination practices that clearly the French state is not taking seriously, was not taking seriously 20 or 30 years ago, but is clearly not taking seriously right now.
I just want to understand concretely what were the examples that people that you spoke to mentioned that kind of were behind their decision to leave France.
Yeah, I would say there are three categories of people by and large. There are people whose access to the French job market is completely closed. I'm talking about hijabi women, for instance. Then you get a second category of people. Sometimes they have pretty good jobs or they have solid qualifications in this and that, but they feel the glass ceiling with people telling us, well, I was doing really well at my job. I was delivering more than a certain number of people with really typically French sounding names, but ultimately I didn't get the promotion. And then you get the third category of people who are really the frustrated ones. In other words, those that really have good jobs, that they get promotion, but they are people who are frustrated because they feel really irritated by the sheer repetition of Islamophobic jokes, references to Ramadan, references to drinking alcohol, jokes about the hijab, references to the terrorist attacks in France. And these are really a sort of a litany of microaggressions that you're talking about. And by the time they return home after a long day of work, they switch on the TV and you get endless controversies around the veil or that sort of thing. And so I think a phrase that was very often repeated in the interviews that we conducted was, in France, I couldn't breathe anymore. Ideally, this is typically the kind of thing that should make the French state wonder about how it treats its own Muslims. And I really want to underline the adjective, its own Muslims here, because obviously the vast majority of the people that we talk to, they are French. So the question of their integration is not even a debate. They are French. They were born and bred in France.
And were there, in terms of ethnic groups, obviously you talk about Muslims, and this is your main focus, but was there clear patterns? They were mostly maybe North African, Arab. What was the main ethnic groups that you found in this research?
We tried to speak to as many people as possible from an ethnic cultural viewpoint. In other words, indeed, there was a vast majority of people who originate from the Maghreb. I think it would be a lie to claim otherwise. So, which means that there is a strong post-colonial reality to our research by and large. But we also felt that there was a substantial minority of people that we talked to with really typically French-sounding names. In other words, these people are converts. And converts to Islam, particularly in France, the racism that they meet with by the time they convert, particularly women who wear hijabs, it's really very violent. It's really in your face.
After the parliamentary election, there was a sense of relief because the left-wing alliance managed to come ahead in the second round. But overall, it was quite a shock for a lot of Muslims and ethnic minorities in general in France. Do you think this is going to exacerbate this almost exodus phenomenon?
It's hard to foresee the future in very precisely, but clearly, let me just start by saying that more than 9 out of 10 of the people that we talk to, they feel that they don't want to return to France. The very recent news about the parliamentary elections that were very awkwardly introduced by Emmanuel Macron only seems to corroborate these people's perception that indeed there's something almost implacable, almost inevitable in the rise of the far right in France. And the fear for their relatives, for instance, they really are concerned about their parents or their siblings or their cousins and friends. They also underline the fact that these endless polemics around the veil or around the abaya or around the burkini in France, they really feel that they stress the fact that many of their colleagues, like in London, Toronto, New York, many of their colleagues that are non-Muslim, when they look at the situation in France, they are thinking, what's wrong with this country? There's something insane about this situation.
What's happening right now in the Olympics, the image strikes as a reflection of the paradox, in a way, that is in the French society, where you have, on the one hand, this vibrant, diverse communities, but also you have this harsh anti-ethnic sentiments. We've seen it in the Olympics by the sheer numbers of athletes from Black African or Arab origin. In the opening ceremony, the symbol of Zinedine Zidane carrying the Olympic flame. And on the other hand, a ban on French female Muslim athletes from wearing the hijab. How does France justify or make sense of these polar opposite stances?
Indeed, there is astounding ethnic diversity within the Olympic Games, different teams. Is that a sign of integration, or is it a sign of something else? In other words, a lot of sports in France are very divided in social class terms. Obviously, if you play golf, you generally don't come from the same social class as if you practice football. So small wonder that a certain number of sports would indeed have a large number of ethnic minority people, particularly sports that are available for the masses. This, if anything, confirms that the masses in France, the working classes, or people that originate from the working classes, are themselves very ethnically diverse. Then I want to lay stress on the point that is often articulated by my colleague and friend Hicham Ben Aissa, who works on Islam and the job market in France. Ethnic diversity, or the stress or the promotion of diversity in France, stops when Islam starts. So it's a paradox that helps you understand the bizarre reality of a country that is really remarkably ethnically diverse, whilst at the same time there is this sort of national obsession around Islam and around the veil in particular.
It would seem that it's not just far-right ideologies, but also state legislation and policies towards religious minorities that led to anti-immigration sentiments becoming so mainstream in France. What does it mean for the self-identity of people from these communities?
France, for many of our interviewees, if it means their friends, if it means maybe the neighborhood where they grew up, if it means their first job experiences, if these were good experiences, if it means what kind of football team you support if you like football, or the kind of socialization that they experience through school, the kind of popular culture they share, this is something they love, France. But if France means the political system, if it means the whole obsession around laïcité, if it means the way the state is turning a blind eye to obvious cases of discrimination through a very abstract clinging to, universalist principles, this is something that they don't like. And this is part of the reason why they have decided to leave it. To leave your native country, of course, is a very difficult choice.
Have you recommended any kind of solutions or steps that the French government can take to tackle this issue?
As close as we come to giving policy recommendations, what we lay stress on is the economic cost, the economic and the symbolical cost of religious and ethnic discriminations in France. Again, the French state needs to be spending so much more money on tackling different forms of discrimination, and that includes religious discrimination, because ultimately the French state and the French economy is a loser. And that, again, has been shown very persuasively by studies carried out by economists. The second point is, I really wish we could emancipate ourselves collectively from this national narrative around secularism. We don't need to label it secularism to ensure that there is religious freedom in France and to ensure that there is a French public neutrality and separation of church and state.
That's it from Beyond the Headlines. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and Arthur Edison. Yasmin Taji is the assistant producer, and Dua Farid is our editor. And I'm your host, Fathi Ben Isa.